much. Thanks a lot for coming on the show. I was wondering, could you give us a brief introduction to yourself and what you do, please?
Well, basically, I'm just an old Texas newspaper reporter, but I have a degree in journalism. I got a classical education where we actually read books and talked about concepts instead of merely feeling good about ourselves. And I have followed a number of topics. I cut my teeth on the Kennedy assassination and ended up writing a book called Crossfire, The Plot to Kill Kennedy, which was a basis for the Oliver Stone film, JFK. And then that led me on to other government conspiracies and cover-ups. My book, Alien Agenda, I've been told, is the top-selling nonfiction book on UFOs in the world. It's been translated in about a dozen languages. And then that led to the question about, well, who speaks for Earth? Who's in control of this planet? And that led to Rule by Secrecy, which traced the histories of the secret societies all the way back to the ancient Sumerian civilization. And then that led to my book on 9/11, The Terror Conspiracy, which basically lays out in fully documented and footnoted sources the fact that 9/11 was an inside job. Then that led on to the rise of the Fourth Reich. Who are these people that are trying to run everything? And then that just led right on up. Now, my latest book, The Sisterhood of the Rose, is my first foray into fiction. It's a novel, okay? But actually, Ken, I like to call it a work of faction. It's fact-based fiction. For example, in there, in real life, history students and some of the older people will recall the strange and mysterious flight of Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess to England, where he parachuted out and was taken into custody and then held for the rest of his life. That was all a British intelligence operation. And in real life, they obtained the services of an unnamed French astrologer who was put into touch with Haushofer, Rudolf Hess's astrologer, and was convinced that the stars were right and the time was propitious for Hess to fly to England and make peace between Germany and Great Britain. And of course, that didn't happen. But involved in this British intelligence operation, which was quite successful in getting rid of one of the top Nazis, was a British intelligence agent by the name of Ian Fleming, which we all might recognize as the person who, after his government service, wrote the James Bond novels.
Yeah.
So all that's very true. So all I've done, I recount that whole thing in The Sisterhood of the Rose, and the only fiction is I've thrown my main character, Giselle. She is the unnamed French astrologer. So it's a blending of fact and fiction.
All right, so can you tell us a bit about the actual kind of underpinning kind of storyline of the book?
Oh, okay. Well, Giselle Tchaikovsky was a American-born ballerina and quite a child prodigy. And in the early 1930s, as a very young girl, 12, 13, 14, she toured Europe dancing as this ballerina. And as a result, came into contact with many well-to-do and well-established people and even some famous personages. But she grew tired of, as she grew older, she grew tired of all the publicity and the constant glare of the public. And so she quit dancing and went to college and studied archaeology. And so by 1939, she ended up in Belize, which at that time was, I think, British Honduras. And they made a discovery of an amazing crystal skull that was reportedly, and according to legend, a totem of great power. she and her lover at that time, he was killed, she was left for dead, and a German man stole the skull, took it back to Europe, and presented it to Adolf Hitler, which, along with the spear of Longinus and other occult objects, reportedly gave Hitler all this great power, and that's why he was so successful early in the war. And so the rest of the book is Giselle's journey back to back to Europe, and her efforts to regain the crystal skull. But in the process, she finds out that the Nazis have located the greatest treasure trove in history, Solomon's treasure, and that it's located in a cave system in the Pyrenees between France and Spain. And so now she's not only after the skull, but she's trying to stop the Nazis from gaining Solomon's treasure. And again, that sounds like some kind of really far out book, but there is documentation and evidence that the Nazis did go to southern France in early 1944 and did excavate in search of Solomon's treasure.
Interesting. Yeah, earlier on, you referred to your book, The Fourth Reich, and you said there was a connection between this book and that book. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Okay, well, the Sisterhood of the Rose, of course, is, like I said, fact-based fiction. Many of the people that are named in it, Margaret Burke White, Eva Brown, Clara Petacci, Ernest Hemingway, of course, these are all real people, and they were at the places where they're describing the book and doing the things that it's all about. All I did was weave in some characters like Giselle, who, by the way, I'm saying it's a novel, but I got this story from a friend of mine, Celeste Levesque, who, beginning back in the early 90s, told me this incredible story and said that she had had a near-death experience, and after that she had begun to have conscious recall of a past life as Giselle. So this is her recollections of her past life. Now, of course, I couldn't necessarily prove that, especially since so much of the work she did was secret and based on a secret society. So I finally just decided, well, I can't prove it. I can't write it as a nonfiction book, so I'll just write it as a novel. And so that's what I did. But so much of what I deal with is also covered in my New York Times bestseller nonfiction book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich.
Yeah.
And as ominous as that sounds, there is plenty of documentation to show that while the Allies beat the Germans in World War II, no question about that, we did not beat the Nazis. Nazi, of course, is a acronym in the German language for National Socialist. And the National Socialists, the Nazis, they never surrendered. They never gave up. In fact, a lot of the top Nazis, not the very top, they were too public, so they all either got caught or committed suicide or disappeared, like Martin Bormann. And but many thousands of them were actually brought to the United States by the High Commissioner of Germany after the war, John J. McCloy, and his protege, Alan Dulles, who became head of the Central Intelligence Agency. And interestingly enough, it was these two men who were among the more prominent Americans before the war who funded and helped create Hitler and the Third Reich. John J. McCloy is head of National City Bank. That was the largest lender of money to the German government prior to the war. And Alan Dulles was an attorney for Sullivan and Cromwell, who represented the Baron von Schroeder Bank, which was another giant supporter of Hitler and the Nazis. And they were also, Hitler was also aided by an official at Union Banking Corporation, whose name was Prescott Bush. Yes.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
yeah, and the grandfather of George W. Bush. So you can see that, as they say, as the saying is at our National Archives, the past is prologue. If you understand who these people and personalities were prior to the war. You see they're still in place after the war, and they brought National Socialism to the United States. But of course, as it began to take a firm choke on the U.S. government, they couldn't go under the name National Socialist. That's pretty obvious. So what they're known now is as neoconservatives, neocons, which is actually National Socialist.
Yeah. One thing I've always been fascinated with the post-World War II activities of the Nazis. There were some actual official groups started, weren't there? I think prior to the war ending, one I think was called Odessa. I was wondering, have you ever heard of the Odessa group? Or?
Oh yes, Odessa. Yes, that was the organization of ex-SS men, and there were several others. Despina. These collectively are known as the Rat Line. This is the rats deserting the ship. And interestingly enough, many of these Nazis that escaped Europe did so on papers that were given to them by the Vatican. So the Catholic Church is up to its neck in letting the Nazis get out of Europe. It's like in my book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich, you have to understand that when you're talking about a Nazi, you're not necessarily talking about a goose-stepping German. You're talking about someone who embraces the philosophy of National Socialism. And one of the key aspects of National Socialism is the blending of state and corporate power, which you certainly see in the United States. And that, of course, is that combination of state and corporate power is the very dictionary definition of fascism.
What kind of got you into the whole sort of into what they call conspiracy writing, I suppose, or conspiracy theory? What was the? There must have been a kind of a moment in your life where you suddenly turned to this kind of writing.
Well, I'm not sure I ever quite had an absolute epiphany, but I would have to say I guess it started with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In November 22nd, 1963. At that time, I was a college student, and I was already on a degree plan for journalism, and I was already working as a reporter for a Texas newspaper. And I just thought, this is a heck of a story, and it happened right here in my backyard because I was going to the University of North Texas, which is located in Denton, Texas, and that's only about 30 miles north of Dallas. In fact, Dallas is where we'd all go to party. In fact, less than a month before the assassination of President Kennedy, I was in Jack Ruby's Carousel Club. I have a photograph of me taken there and dancing on the stage. I don't know what happened. I think I must have drank something I shouldn't. And I actually met Jack Ruby. So I knew who the people were in Dallas. I knew what was happening in Dallas and who ran the city. And when the Kennedy assassination occurred, I was as shocked as anyone else. But then on Sunday, when I'm sitting watching television, I see Oswald killed by Jack Ruby while handcuffed to police officers in the basement of the Dallas police station. I just immediately thought, wait a minute, something's not right about this. So I began to pay closer attention. And the next thing that I can remember really making an impression on me was that they all said that Kennedy had been killed by Lee Harvey Oswald using a bolt-action World War II Italian war rifle. And yet all the witnesses and even some of the sound recordings made showed that there was a pow and then a pause and then a pow, pow, two shots, just one on top of each other. And I knew at that point, having had bolt-action rifles of my own and had been deer hunting and other types of hunting, that you cannot get a pow-pow from a bolt-action rifle. You have to cock the bolt. And even in the Warren report, the FBI acknowledged that it takes 2 seconds just to cock the bolt and pull the trigger of a bolt-action rifle. And yet these two sounds were closer than 2 seconds apart. So I knew something was funny going on then, but I really didn't begin to understand the level at which the assassination was carried out until about 1972, late 72, when McCord one of the Watergate burglars finally opened up in court and said, well, actually, I'm working for the committee to re-elect the president, which was President Richard Nixon. And at that point, I realized that even the president of the United States could and would lie to us. And then that began to explain the conspiratorial aspects of the Kennedy assassination. But the Kennedy assassination actually is pretty simple. Both the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and even the American Medical Association's investigation and study of the assassination all proclaimed that Kennedy had been killed from bullets from a high-velocity rifle. Okay, and yet gun experts can tell you that the Mannlicher Carcano 6.5 millimeter Italian war rifle that they said belonged to Lee Harvey Oswald is not a high-velocity rifle. Ergo, Oswald could not have killed Kennedy.
Yeah, interesting. So tell us a little bit about the kind of social climate at the time in America. I mean, JFK was quite a beloved president, I believe. And could you give us a bit of kind of social?
Not in Texas.
Yeah, could you give us?
Yeah, you know, Ken, you hit a very, very important point there. This is so astute of you. You have to understand and put the assassination of Kennedy into the context of the times. Kennedy was not liked or respected much in Texas. Now, me personally, I was just a young guy. I didn't have any particular hardened political beliefs, and I thought he was a nice-looking guy, and I thought it was kind of cool to have such a pretty wife and have those cute little kids crawling around in the Oval Office in the White House. But as far as his politics went, you know, we were all told that he was too liberal. He was a Catholic. I can remember growing up in the Baptist church in Texas, and they said if Kennedy gets elected, this country's going to be run by the Vatican, you know, that type of thing. And then of course it was the time of the Cold War. It was time of the Cuban, and then when the Cuban Missile Crisis came along, and it was there was a lot of fear and hatred towards the old Soviet Union, and so the watchword of the day was anti-communism. So anything anybody did that you didn't like, then they were probably a communist sympathizer. And so down especially in the South and Southwest, Kennedy was viewed as kind of a northeastern liberal and probably a pro-communist type person. And there's I guarantee you in Texas, when the news came that he had been assassinated, there was more than a few that went good, you know. That's a good thing. Of course, today we're a lot more sophisticated, a lot more, our consciousness has been raised, and now I see Kennedy as a president, one of the few presidents in the history of the United States who actually tried to do and make decisions in the best interest of all the people of the United States, not just the special moneyed elite. And of course, that's what got him killed.
Do you think the proximity to where you were, where the assassination happened, or do you think it was generally because you were a Texan? Because as you say, the Texans weren't particularly fond of Kennedy. What do you think has the biggest factor in your interest in the assassination? Because you said at the time you were quite young and you didn't necessarily have the political mind to dislike Kennedy. What do you think has most shaped your interest?
I would have to say it was just basic curiosity. I've always been a curious person, and I've always been a seeker of truth and knowledge, and I simply want to know what's going on. For example, in the Kennedy assassination, you know, if the mafia killed him, okay, all right. If Castro killed him, okay. If it was a lone nut, I can accept that too. In fact, let me tell you, I spent a lot of time with Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, Marguerite Oswald, and she told me on more than one or two occasions, she said, you know, I could accept the idea that my son killed the president if they would simply prove it to me. But they never proved it to her satisfaction, and frankly, they never proved it to my satisfaction. And in fact, according to the polls today, they haven't proved it to the satisfaction of about 85% of the Americans today. But officially, of course, that's still the story. So it's basically, I've tracked conspiracies and mysteries because I just simply want to know the truth.
One thing I've always thought was overlooked in the assassination of Kennedy is the viewpoint from Marina Oswald. Now, you mentioned Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. Marina was Lee Harvey Oswald's wife.
Right.
For 25 years, her evidence and whatever she said supported the idea that she believed her husband did do it, or at least could have done it. Then, in September 1998, she changed her story, I think, to say that she no longer believed that he acted alone. What do you think that says about her? Because then it opens up the possibility that the FBI wanted her to incriminate Oswald very early on. What do you think happened? What do you think happened in September 1988 for her to come out and say, well, actually, I don't think that he did act alone? What motive did she have?
To tell the truth. She knew the truth all along. Early on, within a day or two after the assassination, she's saying stuff like, Lee was a good man. He knows she'd kill anybody, okay? But then after being held by federal authorities for months on end, and I'm sure pretty well browbeaten, plus, keep in mind, she couldn't speak English very well, plus she had two small children that she cared about and wanted to protect, and was very much subject to deportation back to Russia. So, they had every kind of hammer hanging over her. So it was easy then to convince her, well, the evidence shows Lee did it. So she went, well, in fact, I believe that's what she said early on. Said, well, the evidence shows he was guilty. Okay.
Yeah, that was back in the day. But and of course, even back then, there was a lot of evidence to suggest from her and from many of his associates that he was psychotic and violent.
Yeah. For example,
why would she change her story 25 years later on? Because it's safe.
Because she grew up, she matured, and she learned English. Now she can speak perfectly good English. Plus, she's not a stupid person. I've met her several times. She's a very bright lady, and she studied and she looked at what was going on, and now she knows, that he didn't do it.
If that is the case, which it may well be, why wouldn't she? Do you think she fears for her own life that if she would say, I was forced to say this, do you think she's deliberately holding back from saying what really happened? From the FBI's point of view.
Yes, I think she's holding back, maybe in several areas, for that very reason. Yes, for the protection of her daughters and of her own life. Because in my book Crossfire, I detail about more than 100 people who I termed convenient deaths, in that it was convenient for them to die before they could tell exactly what they knew about the assassination. And I'll be the first to admit that I'm not saying that all 100 died unnatural deaths, but many of them did. And I think that, and I can tell you from my personal background and experience, as I said, I was in Dallas at that time, and there was a palpable aura of fear in that city because so many people knew that what the official story was saying was not what actually happened. And yet they, too, were whispering and talking about all the number of people who had died in mysterious accidents and falls and auto wrecks and sudden heart attacks. And so and this is one of the things, Ken, that actually got me onto the assassination story, other than the ones I've already mentioned, which is within a few years of the assassination, I was working full-time as a professional newsman for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and I would go to Dallas quite frequently. And over in Dallas, when I get through with, whatever story I was working on, I'd say, well, hey, by the way, what can you tell me about the Kennedy assassination? And it was amazing. Here were very hardened politicians, city and county officials, and tough cigar-chewing police, brass, and they would literally almost turn white and begin squirming in their seat. And it was obvious that they were very afraid of something. And, of course, right then, I'm going, now, wait a minute. If Oswald, this lone schnook, did the job, what are they so afraid of? And of course, now I understand. Just like Robert Kennedy, right before he was assassinated, he was asked about his brother's death, and he told university students in California, he said, "I cannot do anything about the death of my brother until I have the power of the presidency," which tells me he understood what I understand and what I'm telling you, which is there will be no truth until you can wring the truth out of the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service, the U.S. military, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Because it was a political assassination, and it was a coup d'etat.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing I find particularly interesting about the whole JFK event is the kind of backstory of Lee Harvey Oswald. Prior to the shooting, I was wondering, could you give us a bit of a kind of back history of Lee Harvey Oswald, because there's some really interesting stuff in there that the listeners might not know about.
Right. Well, of course, according to the official pronouncements, he was just a disgruntled ex-Marine who defected to the Soviet Union and told them and anyone that he was going to give them military secrets, which makes him a traitor. He renounced his U.S. citizenship, but he did it on a Saturday, and they said, well, you have to come back next week and fill out the paperwork, which he never did do. And so when he decided a year later he wanted to come back to the United States, not only did they allow him back in with no problem, but they even loaned him the money to come back on. He is a very mysterious character. And yet, and he came back, and supposedly he was handing out pro-Castro literature on street corners, and he supposedly was a pro-communist, pro-Castroite, and yet when you look at the people he was actually connected to and in touch with, they were anti-communist and people with backgrounds in U.S. intelligence or U.S. military. His mother told me time and time again, my son works for the United States government. And now today, of course, there was no way to prove that early on because he had very carefully followed orders and set himself up with a legend, as they say in intelligence, of being a pro-communist. But today, there is just overwhelming evidence to show that he was actually a low-level intelligence operative for the United States government. And he was only posing as a communist, which made him a perfect patsy for the assassination, and that's what he himself said in the Dallas police station. He said, "No, sir, I didn't kill anybody. I'm just a patsy," which is really interesting because he didn't say, "I'm innocent," and he didn't say, "I didn't do it." He said, "I'm a patsy." In other words, I've been set up to take the blame for this crime. And voice stress analysis shows that there was no tension in his voice. He was telling the truth, and there's a bunch of evidence to back that up.
So,
sorry, Ken. You asked for a sort of a background for Oswald's history before the assassination, leading up to the assassination. I was just wondering what Jim's views were, or your opinions on the claim that, and I think it's quite a lot of evidence points towards the claim that Oswald was that attempted to kill Major General Edwin Walker. I think that was in April of the same year.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I think he was set up for that too, and I'll tell you why. In the fall of 1964, just a month or two after the Warren Commission had issued their report, I went to Dallas, went to his Turtle Creek home, and sat down with General Edwin Walker and had an in-depth interview with him. And at that time, there were people whispering in Dallas saying, Lyndon Johnson was probably behind this, and therefore is probably a right-wing assassination, okay? Because everybody knew that Kennedy was considered so liberal. So I went, and there was this little question in the back of my mind, maybe General Walker, who was pretty much headed up a lot of the hardcore right-wingers there in Dallas. I said, maybe he had a role to play in this. But I was soon lost that thought because Edwin Walker told me, we were talking about the Warren Commission report, and he said, well, Rubenstein, he called Jack Ruby Rubenstein, which was his real name. He said Rubenstein and Oswald knew each other, and they're connected. And he said, so the Warren Commission's wrong, and they're going to have to start over just on that one fact alone. Well, that told me that General Walker and the Dallas right wing did not have anything to do with the assassination. Otherwise, he would not have been going against the Warren report. He would have been supporting it. So we also talked about the shooting that somebody had taken a shot at him back in, I think you're right, I think about April of '63. And I asked him, did he think that it was Oswald who had took a shot at him? And he said, no, I don't think so, because he said at the time the police told me that the slug they dug out of my wall was a .30-06, and Oswald was never known to own or possess a .30-06 rifle. So, does that answer your question?
Well, if Oswald was set up for it, why was he set up for it? Because nothing ever came of it, really, in relation to the Kennedy assassination. If he was set up for that, anybody with a brain would say, well, hang on, if he's being set up for that, it's surely being set up to be used later.
Are you talking about
along
being
the lines
set up? Yeah, are you talking about being set up for the General Walker shooting?
Yes, the General Walker shooting.
Yeah, okay, all right. Well, here's the thing. Nobody heard of Oswald. Nobody said he was a suspect until after the assassination. Well, it was easy enough to say, well, we think Oswald did that, and then that just, impresses on the public mind how violence-prone he was. It's like this. Every police department would love to close the book on a crime. And at the time of the Kennedy assassination, that was still an open case because they had not caught anybody who took a shot at Walker. So it was, if nothing else, it was convenient for the police to say, well, that was probably Oswald, and they closed the book on the case.
The one kind of claim within the whole JFK event or theory or whatever, I've always just found it unbelievable. It's the most crazy of all the bits of quote-unquote evidence thrown out is the magic bullet theory. Could you because not every listener we've got here will know what the magic bullet theory is. Could you give us a bit of background on that and your own theories on it?
Okay, well, here was the problem. Early on, the official government story was that there had been 3 shots fired at Kennedy by Lee Harvey Oswald from the 6th floor of the School Book Depository. The first shot hit Kennedy in the back, and the second shot hit Connally and wounded him, and the third shot hit Kennedy in the head and killed him. Okay? That is a plausible theory. The problem is that as the Warren Commission went along and it got into the spring of 1964, they had to deal with a 4th shot because James Tague a bullet struck the curb near his feet down on Commerce Street, and it actually sent a chip up and bloodied his cheek, and he was actually, though not by name, that event was detailed in at least 2 a police report and a deputy sheriff's report. So, and James Tague tried to go and talk to the Warren Commission, and they were ignoring him. They didn't want to hear about that. But then an assistant U.S. attorney in Dallas sent the Warren Commission a letter along with a Dallas news clipping stating there was a bullet mark on the street. So all of a sudden, they can't ignore a U.S. attorney. So all of a sudden, they're confronted with a 4th bullet, which, of course, 3 bullets in 6 seconds just stretched the probability that one person could do all that, and a 4th shot would make it impossible. So they had to explain. So rather than explain the 4th shot, what they did was Arlen Specter, who is now under a cloud of problem with his voters. He was a young lawyer for the Warren Commission, and he comes up with the single bullet theory, which says the first shot pierced Kennedy's neck and then went right on and struck Governor Connally, caused all his wounds. The second shot missed and hit the curb. Nick James Tague explains that. And then the third shot hit Kennedy in the head. Well, it's a ridiculous theory because, for one thing, according to the autopsy, Kennedy was struck in the back, at the third thoracic vertebra, which is below your shoulder blades. And yet, we now know there was a bullet hole in his throat at the level of the Adam's apple. Well, if you connect a hole in the back at the third thoracic vertebra and connect it to the Adam's apple, you got an upward trajectory, which is impossible for a bullet coming in a downward trajectory. So it's just a cockamamie lie that they told to the public, and because it was an official pronouncement and there was no one calling their bluff on this for many years, it just got stuck in the public consciousness. And so that's why today, though, the single bullet theory has become known as the magic bullet theory, because for that to have worked, the bullet would have had to come down at a steep downward angle, hit Kennedy in the back, then somehow course upwards, come out his throat in an upward trajectory, somehow twist in midair, go back down, strike Connally at the right armpit in the back, shatter his fifth rib, come out his chest near the right nipple, somehow go into the top side, front side of his wrist, shatter the wrist bone, one of the most dense bones in the human body, come out and then end up over and then penetrate his left thigh. None of that makes any sense.
Jim, it's very interesting, that magic bullet theory, but what I think the magic bullet theory relies upon is that Governor Connally and President Kennedy were firstly sitting at the same height and were also sitting in a line with each other, but the car that they were in was not designed that way. Kennedy was a lot higher than Connally, and
exactly. Connally was on a jump seat. He wasn't even sitting on a normal seat. He was in a little fold-down jump seat, and although Kennedy and Connally, I think, were pretty close the same in height, Connally, all you have to do is look at the photographs. He's sitting much lower than President Kennedy.
A lot of the people who like to debunk the conspiracy theories will use that to say that they'll shrug off the magic bullet theory by saying, well, look, for the magic bullet theory to work, they have to be sitting in a line directly in front of one another, and the fact that they weren't instantly debunks the theory. But actually, what it could do is it could increase the chances of increase the possibility that it is just a wild theory, because the distance between them was even greater than was originally thought.
All right, how do you explain this? According to Connally's own doctor, he had to treat the exit wound in Kennedy's chest for infection because the bullet, both men were wearing mohair jackets, and the bullet would push fibers of the mohair into the wound, which would cause an infection. Connally was treated for an infection on his exit wound, but he had no infection on his entrance wound, which means that bullet had not gone through Kennedy's jacket.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's always a theory that's I think is again, it's overlooked, and I think it needs a bit more sort of investigation. I did actually watch one documentary.
I think what actually happened was Kennedy was hit once in the back. He was hit from the front in the throat, and he was hit possibly simultaneously or almost simultaneously by two shots, one from the rear, one from the front, on the right side of his head. Connally was hit twice. One bullet entered his chest, the other came and entered his wrist and went over in his left thigh. But of course, if they admitted to that, then they're admitting to two shooters, and they would not admit to that.
Have you seen the documentary, The Kennedy Assassination Beyond Conspiracy?
Yes.
Do you know that? Yes.
Yes, I do. That was a documentary that was a factual documentary.
Yeah,
it was made as a supplement to the JFK movie, and it's really extraordinary. I would encourage everyone to try to get a copy and view that, because that'll tell you what really went on.
Well, I do like that documentary. And in that, they did have... Well, actually, I think you might be thinking of a different documentary to me. It might have had a different title in America, but in this documentary, I can't remember the name of the man, but I believe he was about 80 years old, and he stood in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository in the same window ledge, and he showed that even as an 80-year-old man, that gun, the same model gun, the Mannlicher Carcano rifle, could be fired 6 times within the allotted 4-second time frame. He was an 80-year-old man.
Yes. I have some German Mauser rifles, and yes, I can squeeze off 3 shots in 6 seconds, all right? But am I going to hit a moving target going downhill laterally away from me with a tree obscuring the line of sight. I don't think so, and nobody's been able to duplicate that. In fact, I was in England one time, or shortly after the movie came out, and I was in Liverpool, and we went down to the docks, and they had a police sharpshooter, and he tried to duplicate that shot, and he couldn't do it. He said, "You can't do this."
I think for every person that says it can't be done, or every documentary that says it can't be done,
people who say it can. Yeah. And of course, the power, the forces that were behind the assassination are still in power in the United States and in Great Britain. And so officially, you're not going to have anyone, official come out and say no, it couldn't work. But unofficially, they all say it can't work. And one of the top snipers in the world is a friend of mine, Craig Roberts, who got medals for his sniper work in Vietnam. He tried to do it, and he says it can't be done.
Yeah.
Interestingly, you talked about the official side of things. It brings me nicely onto an element that I'd love to hear your viewpoint on it. The three tramps.
Right. Well, one of those tall tramps has been definitely identified as Charles Harrelson, who was a convicted assassin. He was convicted of murdering a federal judge. And he more or less confessed to participation in the Kennedy assassination because he told a Dallas Morning News reporter while he was in jail in Dallas, he said, "I can't talk while I'm here in jail, but when I get out, I'll give you the biggest story you ever had." And it has to do with November the 22nd, 1963. And there's a photograph of him as the tall tramp. These three so-called tramps, although they were wearing unused clothing, and they had shiny shoes, and they didn't much look like tramps. And they were escorted back through Dealey Plaza on the way to the Dallas County Sheriff's Office, and they were photographed. The old man tramp has been identified as Chauncey Holt. Again, another man who was connected to the CIA.
And E. Howard Hunt was allegedly one of them as well, wasn't there?
Yes, there's a photograph of him in Dealey Plaza.
What I think is most amazing is that they were held for 4 days until they were released after the assassination.
Right.
It's quite a long time, isn't it?
And then, well, actually, I think they were released a lot quicker than that. I don't think they were held for 4 days.
No, I believe they were released on the 26th of November.
Well, that's just the Monday after the Friday assassination.
It's a long time, isn't it?
That weekend. Yeah, that's a long time, and then that's because I think that there were people who were not in the know who truly believed that they were part of the assassination. But then, when the federal officials all said, no, Oswald did it all by himself, they let him go. And there was, for the longest time, for years, there was no record of these three guys. And then all of a sudden, 3 arrest reports show up in the Dallas police files, all written in the same handwriting, obviously, and hurriedly written by the same person. And they named 3 other people. They said, oh, this is who the tramps were. Okay, so, I mean, there's a lot of confusion and controversy in all of the evidence. One of the strongest pieces of evidence that they used to convict Oswald in the minds of the public was that on Monday night following the assassination, Henry Wade just offhandedly said, oh, as I mentioned, we've got his fingerprints on the rifle. Okay, well, that sounds like pretty damning evidence, and it certainly sold the public on the idea that Oswald did it. But if you look at the facts, it's not what it's cracked up to be. The rifle was shipped to the FBI crime lab that Friday night, and on Saturday, in a document signed by J. Edgar Hoover himself, they said they could find no usable prints on the rifle or even the inner parts of the rifle. On Sunday, the rifle was sent back to Dallas, and on Monday morning was carried over to Miller Funeral Home by 2 FBI agents, and the funeral home director, Paul Grudy, who is still alive and who would tell you this himself. And he said, in fact, he said it on national radio just about a year ago, that he was there when they put Oswald's dead hand on the rifle, and he had a tough time getting the fingerprint ink off of Oswald's dead hand in time for the burial. So in other words, that's where the fingerprints came from.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Well, another theory, I've never really actually sort of seen anything really mentioned about this before, but I heard Robert Anton Wilson talking about it once. So there was some kind of strangeness surrounding JFK's body when it was moved from Dallas to Washington, I believe.
Absolutely. The wounds to President Kennedy's body, as observed by a whole bevy of medical experts, doctors, medical technicians at Parkland Hospital differed widely with what was viewed at the autopsy of President Kennedy. And what that suggests is that there were alterations made to the body prior to the autopsy to make it appear as if he had been shot from the rear.
How would they have gone about doing that?
I'm sorry?
How would they have actually gone about doing that, do you think?
Well, according to Doug Horn, who was the analyst of military records for the Assassination Records Review Board, he is now on the record as saying that the autopsy photographs are phonies. Okay, Floyd Reedy, the man who took the original autopsy photographs, is on the public record saying that the photographs that the government is now showing reportedly of Kennedy's body at autopsy are not the photographs he took. So, see, there's been a lot of official misconduct in the evidence. That's why this case is still considered controversial, although it's really not a true controversy. It only seems controversial because there's such a wide disparity between the official pronouncements and then those who've actually studied the case.
Jim, at the top of the show, Ken mentioned that it was your book that inspired the hugely successful JFK film, and I'm sure you'll be aware that many people who absolutely love the film for the reason that it was a reenactment of an event that they can look back on with sadness, and that was the day of their youth. And even though the film does have a message, a lot of the people will be completely oblivious or ignorant to the message contained within the film, the plot, as it were. So, obviously, it was based upon your book. I was wondering, could you explain briefly, for those who have seen the film, who enjoy the film, or those who've never seen it, what is the conspiracy theory that is put out by the film JFK, and indeed your book?
Well, I think the evidence shows that Kennedy was killed in an ambush, a military-style ambush, a triangulation of fire, 3 shooters possibly, maybe more, and because they could not allow him to leave that plaza alive, or he'd come after everybody involved. And that's what the evidence points to. Again, though, you have the official pronouncements. Now, I was very gratified with the movie because, number one, Oliver Stone, although he based the assassination segment of the movie on my book Crossfire, he did not just take the book and use it. He had a whole research staff headed by a very sharp lady named Jane Rasconi, and they backtracked on my work. They interviewed some of the same witnesses I'd talked to. They looked at the same documentation that I'd looked at, and interestingly enough, they came to the same conclusion. Kennedy was killed by a crossfire by multiple assassins, and it was a coup d'etat.
The subject of JFK is still, I mean, it was kind of really one of the first, what I call super conspiracy theories, wasn't it? It was the real first, it kind of brought a lot of people together, you could say, in terms of, it was a shared conspiracy almost.
and
Right.
It's never ending,
Right.
is it? It's still going on throughout all of the investigations.
Exactly, and that's because even beginning at the time, there were people who disbelieved the official pronouncements because it was not supported by the best evidence. And so once you study it and once you come to the clear understanding of what really happened, and if you're an honest and honorable person, then you're going to continue to stand up for the truth, and that, again, has led to the continued interest and the continuing controversy.
Ken mentioned, you talk about evidence, and Ken mentioned about the body of Kennedy. One of the huge pieces of evidence that people sort of talk about is the loss from the National Archives of Kennedy's brain. Why is the loss of his brain so important? And is it not just pounced upon by conspiracy theorists? I was wondering, why do you think it's a demonstrably fundamental issue of contention with regard to conspiracy theories? Why is it so important, the loss of his brain? What could it prove that it couldn't back in the day?
Well, it could have back in the day, but it wasn't studied, at least not independently. And then when independent researchers might have had an opportunity to try to examine it, then it turned up missing. Oh, we don't know what happened to it, which is pretty incredible in itself. But the importance of the brain cannot be understated. If they had the brain, since he was shot in the head, forensic experts could have examined it and could have told with quite certainty exactly how many bullets had come in and from which direction.
Interesting.
And it is your genuine belief that if it did turn up, even if it turned up today, it could still harbour some sort of evidence.
Yes.
You still believe that after all these years?
Yes, that's why it's not available.
Yeah.
And I mean, think about it, fellas. Think about it. If it was Lee Harvey Oswald all by himself, and the assassination therefore was just kind of an accident of history, then why should there be all this missing evidence? Why should his brain be missing? Why should the original autopsy notes have been burned and then rewritten? Why all of this? I mean, there are bums in Great Britain and in the United States who overdose on wine on the street and who get a better autopsy than the President of the United States.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Over the years, evidence has been released by whoever, the archives. I think the next batch is due to be released in 2017. What do you think is most likely to be uncovered by that in 2017?
Not much.
Do you think it's going to answer any questions?
Not really, because I'm sure that evidence has been gone through with a fine-tooth comb. And, anyone who's expecting that they're going to release a thank you note from Lyndon Johnson to Lee Harvey Oswald, it just isn't going to happen. In fact, people ask me all the time, will we ever know the truth about the Kennedy assassination? And I try to tell them, look, we know the truth now, but you have to study all the evidence. You have to look at the whole thing, put it in context, and then use your own God-given brain and figure out what happened, because it's all there. So you're not really asking the proper question. What you're really asking is, will the government ever hold a press conference and come public and say, okay, folks, here's what really happened? No, that ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions for you, Jim. They're not very good questions, but they're questions that have bugged me for years. In the photo of leading up to his assassination of the Lincoln Continental, were you aware? I spotted it in one of the photos. The door of Kennedy's car is the door which he would have got into the limousine. The door is open at the time he was assassinated. Did you know that?
No, that's a new one on me.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has spotted it. I've searched on the internet, all over the internet, using Google, using specific search terms, and I don't think anybody else has noticed that the door which Kennedy would have used to get into the car was not actually properly shut. It doesn't mean anything, I'm sure, but I've never yet found anybody on the internet that has realised that. And
I'm not going to argue with you, because I'm unfamiliar with the door, but I would say that you may perhaps have the door of the presidential limousine mixed up with the car that Johnson was riding.
No. It's definitely the Lincoln.
That car did have a door open.
Yeah, it's definitely SS100X. The
Okay.
Lincoln. It's definitely
All
Kennedy's.
right.
There's a photo, and in fact, Kennedy is in the photo, and it's only one single photo. I know this is going to go up on Ken's, obviously on SittingNow on the website. And
Yes,
Ken,
I'd like to see that.
Alongside the article, I'd like to link to the photo, which clearly shows Kennedy sitting in his car with the door open. Ken, if you could do that, that would be great.
Sure,
but
yeah, that'd be good.
But yeah, I can't remember which photo it is, but I have got it, and I'll certainly dig it out. Another question I've got is this the final question. It's not an important one, but Jim, do you own any artifacts on the JFK assassination? Do you own anything that was there on the day? Any items of clothing? Because they do come up for auction now and again. I was wondering, did you own any artifacts?
I'm not sure how to answer that, because do I have any artifacts that say belong to Kennedy, belong to the car, or something like that? No, I don't. But I do have a note written to me from Marguerite Oswald, Lee's mother, that says the charges against my son are unfounded. And I do have a invitation to the trademark where he was scheduled to speak at that day, and then of course I began to collect the newspapers from that very day. So I have a pretty good collection of the published material about it, and there's lots of interesting things in there. For instance, the first AP story that went out said that there was a burst of automatic gunfire from the railroad bridge. Well, that would have been in front of him, and a burst of automatic fire is not 3 shots. And of course, that's supported by John Connolly, who in interviews immediately after the assassination said he heard a shot, he knew it was a shot. He began to turn and was trying to get a look and see if it had hit Kennedy when he himself was hit. He did not hear that shot, which is absolutely correct because, a rifle bullet is supersonic. It hits you before the sound reaches you. And then as he was wounded and laying over in his wife's lap, he said he heard more shots and thought to himself, somebody's using an automatic rifle. Well, according to the official version, after he had been hit, there was only one more shot. So why would he think there was an automatic rifle in use? And I submit because there were multiple shots.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, Jim, just before you go, I'd like to just really quickly talk to you about another great book of yours called Above Top Secret, which is I believe came out not so long ago, didn't it? But it's a
yeah. It's been out about a year, but that's everything that they don't want you to know.
Yeah.
It covers a wide range of topics, from the Kennedy assassination to 9/11 to did we actually go to the moon? Is there a Nazi base in Antarctica? Is God an alien? I mean, it's just some really interesting stuff. And I don't profess to have 100% ground truth answers to all of these mysteries and conspiracies, but what I've done there is in each chapter touched on a different conspiracy and then given the pros and cons of it and then try to say, now here's what seems to be the case.
Yeah. I mean, to our listeners, I mean, it's kind of a great kind of coffee table book, isn't it, in some ways, in the way that, it's a good quick reference guide as well, I find.
Exactly. I call it a primer, okay? This is a primer. This is Conspiracy 101 that would kind of introduce you to all these various conspiracies. And my hope was, in writing Above Top Secret, that it would encourage the readers to go and research further on these topics.
So, obviously, you've just, like we said earlier, you've just released your first novel. How's it been received by the people that usually read your nonfiction?
Well, I'd have to say that it's so far it's getting about mixed reviews, about half and half. Half the people who are kind of aware of some of the issues involved in the Sisterhood, such as the Knights Templars, the mystery at Rennes-le-Château in southern France, and the Nazis' hunt for occult objects and artifacts. They love it, and they think it's great because there it all is in a rollicking good story. Other people, like one critic says, well, he thought it was pretty good until he got to the point where Ava Brown was involved, and he thought it just went over the top. And so, of course, if you're locked into a very conventional worldview, then you might think it seems kind of silly, but there, as Shakespeare said, there are more things under heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophies.
So the right people like it, then, you mean?
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's just up. This is this sounds strange, but I guess I'd have to say it's kind of like a good work of art. Okay, the validity of it entirely rests with the reader. You either enjoy it and tend to buy into it, or you don't enjoy it and you don't buy into it.
It's a beautifully presented book as well. I've got the hardback here. I had sent to me from Disinfo. It's a really nice. It's just a great package as well.
Yes, they did a very, very good design on it. For one thing, it's got rounded corners, which is kind of cool because, that kind of sets it apart from most books.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Jim, I'm going to have to get you back on at some point because we only really got into JFK today, so and I want to talk to you about a few other things. So we'll have to get you back on soon if you're up for it.
That's fine. Just give me a shout and we'll go around again.
Okay, and thanks a lot again for coming on the show. And
thank you for answering our questions.
Yeah, we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Ken.
Yeah.